Today I'd like for us to talk about the clean and the unclean. And to start with, I'd like for us to go to the Old Testament book of Ezra. That's not a book of the Bible that's used very much. Although the book of Ezra is in the middle part of the Old Testament, it is actually at the very end of the Old Testament period chronologically. You know, the Old Testament is not in chronological order, and although Ezra's sort of in the middle, it's at the end of the period. Now remember from your Old Testament history how after the death of Solomon, the Hebrew kingdom split into two parts. The Assyrians took over the northern part, which was called Israel. And then about 150 years later, the Babylonians took over the southern part, which was called Judah. And at that time, the Babylonians came in and ransacked the city of Jerusalem and the temple, and they took some of the elite of society to Babylon as captives. Now eventually, after about 70 years, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and the Persians allowed those who had been taken to Babylon, their descendants, to return to Jerusalem if they so chose, and they also allowed them to rebuild the temple. And that's what we see in the book of Ezra. Now, many of the descendants of the original ones taken to Babylon did go back, and they rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. And near the end of the book of Ezra, something happens. It seems that somewhere along the way, many of the men had married foreign women, and they had had children with these women. It was decided that was improper. And so near the end of the book of Ezra, we see all the men gathered together, and they are told that they must send their foreign wives and children away. And that's what they do. They just send them away. Get rid of them. There's no indication in there that any provision was made for them. They just got rid of them. Now that's one of the most disturbing things in the entire Old Testament, and for that reason we don't talk about it much. But I want you to consider the implications of that. You're married to a woman, you have children with her, and one day you just come in and you say, get out. You and the children just get out. You don't say, I'm setting up a trust fund and sending you to live in South Carolina or anything. You don't do that. You just say, get out. And that's what they did. They just got rid of them. Why did they do that? Well, according to the book of Ezra, it's because these people were unclean. So what does it mean to be unclean? Actually, no one really knows for sure. Biblical scholars debate about it. The Greek word used there actually means dirty. But we know that it wasn't that these people had not had a bath yet. That's not what unclean meant. So it refers to something else. Now, in some places in the Old Testament, that same word is used to refer to people that have communicable diseases. And like when they have a contagious disease, they are said to be unclean. And you're supposed to avoid them during what they would consider to be the contagious period. But obviously that meaning doesn't apply here in Ezra. It's not that all those people were sick. Now some maintain that it refers to ritual practices, that people are classified as unclean if they have not gone through the prescribed religious rituals in a certain period of time. Well, that doesn't fit that situation either, because obviously if that was the case, then you just say, you just need to go through these rituals rather than just get rid of them. So there's another opinion as to what that might mean, and it goes like this. By this time, in the Old Testament chronology, the Hebrew people had ceased to exist. And that basically happened when the kingdom split up, and it split into two parts, the Israelites and the Jews. When the Assyrians took over Israel, they more or less assimilated the Israelites into society, and they ceased to exist as a distinct group of people. And so in Ezra's time, all that was left of what had been the Hebrews were the Jews. And the Jews had developed the idea that the Israelites, the people in the north, had never really been God's people in the first place. It had only been just them. And along with that, they developed the idea that they, out of all the people in the world, were the only people that were acceptable to God. The other people in the world were not acceptable to God. God did not like them. God did not want any dealings with them. And therefore they were seen as unclean. So that's another idea of what unclean might mean. Now, it's impossible for us to know exactly what unclean in this context means. But that last one I talked about seems to be the only one that we can find that fits with the context. But whatever its exact meaning may be, we do see in this episode in Ezra that people who were considered unclean were sent away. If someone's unclean, you don't want them around you. You just want to be rid of them. And another thing we see here is obviously when you just take women and children and just send them away, what you're really saying is they don't matter. They're disposable. Now, as our New Testament reading, we heard a passage from Acts. It is Peter's vision of the sheet. The sheet is let down from heaven, and all on that is a bunch of animals and birds and things that, according to Jewish law, you were not supposed to eat. Peter is commanded with the voice, eat. And he says, no, I've never eaten anything unclean. And the voice said, what God has declared clean, you must not call common. Now, while Peter was thinking about what this might mean, there were some men came knocking at the door, and they were from a man named Cornelius. Cornelius had heard Peter was going around talking about Jesus, and Cornelius wanted to hear. So he sent some people to get Peter and bring him to his house. And so they go. When they get there to Cornelius' house, there's all sorts of people there who were not Jews. And you know, Jews were prohibited from entering any place where there was a mixture of people. You could only be around Jews. And so when they went in, Peter said, you know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with or go in to one of another nation. But God has shown me I should not call any man common or unclean. Now here we see the idea of unclean again, and it is coupled with the idea that Jews were not to associate in any way with people who were considered unclean, and that the unclean, of course, are non-Jews. And in this passage we also have another word, the word common. Now that word from Greek is actually where our word common comes from. And what it connotes is shared by all or widespread, in the sense that something common is just about everywhere. Now sometimes we use the word common to denote something negative. Like my mother used to say that if he did something she considered impolite or something, she'd say that's common. But in the biblical usage of common, it doesn't connote a negative. It just connotes something widespread, shared by many. But among the Jews, they used it to refer to all people but them. They believed they were different than everybody else, and everybody else was common, widespread. You have the elite at the top, that was of course them. And then everybody else was common. And please keep in mind that it wasn't in their eyes that they thought they were better. They believed that that came from God. It wasn't that they themselves thought they were special. It was they believed that God thought they were special. Now, in the next chapter of Acts is another interesting episode. Jewish Christians in Jerusalem heard about Peter going into Cornelius' house. And when he went to Jerusalem, they confronted him and said, look, you went into the house and ate with men who are non-Jews. And so these Jewish Christians were aghast that Peter would actually go into the house and eat with somebody who wasn't a Jew. The idea was that if you associated with these unclean people, their dirt could somehow rub off on you. Now later on in Acts is another interesting episode, and this one deals with the Apostle Paul. Paul is in Jerusalem. The Jews are upset with him and they want to kill him. And it gets so heated that the local authorities have to come in and take Paul into protective custody because they're afraid the people, the mob, is just going to kill him. And here's the Jewish complaint against Paul. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, law, and this place. And furthermore, he brought Greeks to this temple and has defiled this holy place. So Paul had the audacity to bring people who were not Jews in the area of the temple, and that defiled it. You see how their dirt could rub off on the temple. You've got to separate yourself from the unclean, lest their dirt rub off on you. Now, in the book of Galatians is something else that's interesting. Paul is upset with Peter. Now, remember in the book of Acts, we saw Peter have the vision of the sheep, and then he went into Cornelius' house because he realized that God was showing him that everybody was acceptable. And remember we talked about how the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem got upset with Peter for doing this. Well, evidently, after they confronted Peter, he decided not to do it again. And then Paul said this, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was to be blamed. Before certain men from James, he would eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. And so you see, Peter, when there was no Jews around, would go in with non-Jews and eat, but when there were Jews around, he didn't. So you separate yourself from the unclean, not because you want to, but because God wants you to. Now, moving on into the Gospels, we see an episode where Jesus is calling his disciples. We heard that as our Gospel reading, he is eating at someone's house. Many tax collectors and the sinners came in and sat down with him. Now there were non-Jews sitting there. The Pharisees saw this and were aghast, and they confront the disciples. Why does your teacher do this? Here again we see this idea, separate yourself from the unclean. But I want us to go back to Peter's vision of the sheep in the book of Acts. The Lord said, what God has declared clean, you must not call common. And then Peter told Cornelius, God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. We need to be clear what is happening. Peter, Paul, and the Scripture are all negating this idea the Jews had that God regarded them above all people. God regarded only them as clean and everyone else unclean. God does not regard any group of people unclean. All are regarded the same in God's sight. And that is something the Jews simply could not accept. And that's why Christianity never made headway among the Jews, because they wanted to maintain their feeling of being special. So we see in the Bible this idea of clean and unclean, this idea that some people are unclean and you must keep away from them. We saw that we see that today in our society, don't we? Don't we have the idea currently in our society that people can be separated out into two categories, the clean and the unclean? The clean don't want to be around the unclean. The clean don't want to hear anything from the unclean. The clean want to shut the unclean up. The unclean should be banished, really. They don't matter. Maybe they need some therapy. They don't matter. In our society today, the unclean are those who won't go along with what society is doing at the moment. The unclean are the ones who won't go along with what society is doing at the moment. Now, in just the past few years, we have been expected to agree with and put up with a lot of major changes, both in society and in organized Christianity. Those who reject going along are seen as unclean. So shut them up. Shut them up. They don't matter. They're disposable. They're deplorable. We're going to make this change, and if you won't go along, we want nothing to do with you. We don't want to hear from you. We don't want to be around you. Can't you see that in our society today? Now I want us to go to the book of Revelation, chapter 13. Some sort of living creature rises up out of the sea. Most Bible translations translate that as beast. But actually, the actual translation of it is just a living creature. It is given the power, throne, and authority of Satan. People marvel at it, at what it can do. And they say, who is like it? They are enthralled with it. And then another one appears. This one comes out of the earth. And it is given the power and authority of the first one. It performs great signs and wonders. People marvel at it. It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. Everyone is enthralled with it. Ominously, it says everyone who refuses to worship and cooperate with it is killed. So consider the situation. Now remember, this is Revelation. It's written in fantasy images, surreal stuff. We don't want to fall into the trap of trying to decipher everything, but we can look at it in general. So here's some representative of Satan that appears on the earth. And whatever this is, whatever it represents, it's not obviously evil. On the contrary, it looks very good. It is disguised very well as good. And it seems to be so good that most everyone is totally enamored with it. It seems to be so good that people just fall over at it. No wonder people do that, though, because it's so good and does such good things. You see, most people, when they look at that in Revelation, they think that this thing's going to be horrible and do evil and it's going to have foam frothing out its mouth, but no. It's going to look so good. So good. It's disguised as good, and people think it is good. By following it, people don't think they're doing evil. They have no idea they're doing evil. They think they're doing good. No one in their right mind would think this is bad. This is good. It's wonderful. But obviously some do oppose it because we see how they're killed. So stop and think for a minute. How do you think the people who went along felt about the people who would not go along? I mean, here's this wonderful thing. It's doing wonderful things, and 99.9% of people are just following all along behind it. What's wrong with these idiots that won't go along with it? Maybe they're good-looking. Oh no, they're the victims of misinformation, fake news. Or maybe they're stupid. Let's get rid of them. That's what happened. They're killed. How do you think the ones who would not go along would have been treated by the ones who went along? It's not hard to imagine that the relative handful of people who would not go along would be considered unclean by the people who went along. After all, they wouldn't get with the program. They wouldn't jump on the bandwagon. And why not? They're idiots, stupid, deplorable. No one in their right mind would oppose and not go along. They're freaks. They don't matter. And so in Revelation, it's not hard to imagine that the people who would not follow along would be considered unclean. Sound familiar? Shut them up. Shut them up. I don't want to hear from them. I don't want to hear what they say. Nobody should hear what they say. Nobody should hear what they say. Shut them up. And so in the book of Revelation, they did get rid of the ones who wouldn't go along. And then they followed this thing right to their doom. But please don't ever forget that it never seemed bad. It always seemed good. They were trying to do good. Maybe the unclean of today, those who won't go along, are like the canaries in the coal mine, warning of danger. No one's paying any attention. They're seen as unclean, and they will be ignored. And even after everything has come crashing down, most people will never even make the connection that maybe if we had listened to them, all this would not have happened. The clean and the unclean. That's the way our society is going at the moment. It will not end well